Hi, Bothered Brigade. Here's what's bothering me today. I need to talk about urine treatment, unfortunately, because there's a bunch of tweets going around because of this video with some clear, ridiculous grifter saying how urine therapy, could totally prove to be the solution to COVID-19. But, do your own research, right? That's basically what we like to call the lawsuit prevention part of the speech. And so that should just tell you that this isn't actually going to work. But yet there's a bunch of people who are thinking, you know what? Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to start drinking my own urine because that kind of checks out. God gives us all we need, right? And so this explains the ivermectin horse paste. And, urine therapy now is the hot new topic with the MAGA crowd. Here's the problem, right? As silly as that is, it speaks to a greater level of fear, right? These are the same people who say, I refuse to live my life in fear, and yet they're afraid of a fucking needle, right? So today is going to be a little different. Today, we're going to do something which normally I don't do, but it's kind of necessary. We're going to go through a full and unfortunately very grim and very long Twitter thread about all the ways in which the pandemic and COVID-19 are not just the flu and just a respiratory disease or virus. Here in Ontario, which we're still getting to in another completely unrelated pandemic video or two or three, because that's just how life is these days. People are mad about the current lockdown and crashing medical systems basically. But the key one I want to focus on is the fact that right now, the current lockdown and because of the critical ICU capacity is precisely because of the unvaccinated, as you can see here in this graph. And so I want to be clear, right? I know we talked about the urine thing at the beginning because that's sort of what prompted this to finally happen today, which quite frankly, not been a great day so far. There's a bunch of ice on the windows. Don't know why. So that's my day. But the core of this is that there's still a lot of people out there who are afraid or hesitant to get the vaccine and are putting their faith in weird, unfounded things like urine therapy. And so what needs to happen is a grim reality check, but not just for them, also for us, so that we can begin to finally realize how truly dangerous and insidious this virus actually is, and why we need to fight like hell with our own leaders and governments to make them do the right thing. So with that, again, this is going to be long, this is going to be dark, but I promise you it ends with some actual hope and optimism. So with that, let's begrudgingly begin. PSA. COVID-19 isn't just a cold, isn't a respiratory virus, and mild doesn't mean what you think it does. If you aren't scared of COVID, this thread is for you. This thread is long and hard to read, not just because of the technical language, but because it's just a cold, the vaccine protects me, and at least our children are safe, are comforting fairy tales. I wish they were true. This virus is like measles and polio, a virus with long-term impact. Even a mild case in a vaccinated individual can lead to long-term issues which cause a measurable uptick in all-cause mortality in the first 6 months and get progressively worse with time. SARS-CoV-2 is a systemic disease which has multiple avenues to induce long-term impairment, attacking the brain, heart, lungs, blood, testes, colon, liver, and lymph nodes, causing persistent symptoms in more than half of patients by 6 months out. The cohort study, limited to non-hospitalized patients in Arizona, mild cases found a 68% prevalence of one or more COVID symptom after 30 days, rising to 77% after 60 days. We will explore an explanation later. Despite a different definition of symptoms, the Bergen study in Norway found that 61% of patients had symptoms after 6 months, including 52% of patients aged 16 to 30 years who had not been hospitalized. To prevent panic, at CDC.gov has been using the term mild to describe any case of COVID-19 which does not require hospitalization. Long COVID, however, is anything but mild, as the replies to Hannah Davis's thread make heartbreakingly clear. A University of Washington study found that 30% of COVID patients had reduced health-related quality of life, with 8% of the patients limited in routine daily activities. These patients are struggling with real physical issues. This Yale study demonstrated reduced aerobic capacity, oxygen extraction, and ventilatory efficiency in mild COVID patients even after recovery from their acute infection. It's also a vascular disease. A Columbia study found significantly altered lipid metabolism during acute disease, which suggests a significant impact of SARS-CoV-2 infection on red blood cell structural membrane homeostasis. Oregon Health and Science University found that symptomatic or asymptomatic SARS-CoV-2 infection is associated with increased risk of fatal cardiovascular outcomes and has causal effect on all-cause mortality. Let's review. SARS-CoV-2 causes an increase in mortality and reduced aerobic capacity even after asymptomatic cases and remains in the body months after the initial infection. No, it's not just a cold, but we're just getting started. It gets worse. Way worse. Oh boy, we have fun here, don't we, folks? The virus appears to be able to cross the blood-brain barrier and cause significant neurological damage. The ability of the spike protein to cross the blood-brain barrier was demonstrated in mice at the University of Washington. A joint study by Stanford and Germany's Saarland University found inflammation in the brain and showed that peripheral T cells infiltrate the parenchyma. For context, the parenchyma is the functional tissue of the brain, your neurons and glial cells. It isn't normally where T cells are. In the brain of healthy individuals, T cells are only present sporadically in the parenchyma. The Stanford study also discovered microglia and astrocytes which displayed features that have previously been reported in human neurodegenerative disease. Well, isn't that just peachy? Postmortem neuropathology in Hamburg, Germany found infiltration by cytotoxic T lymphocytes in the brainstem and cerebellum, with meningeal cytotoxic T lymphocyte infiltration seen in 79% of patients. An autopsy of a 14-month-old at Brazil's Federal University of Rio de Janeiro found that the brain exhibited severe atrophy and neuronal loss. The UK Biobank COVID-19 re-imaging study compared before and after images of mild cases and found pronounced reduction in gray matter and an increase of diffusion indices, a marker of tissue damage in specific regions of the brain. That seems to explain why there is evidence of persistent cognitive deficits in people who have recovered from SARS-CoV-2 infection in Great Britain. Also worrisome are syncytia, where an infected cell extrudes its own spike protein and takes over its neighbors, fusing together to create a large multinucleus cell. Delta's particular aptitude for this may partly explain its severity. And yes, syncytia formation can happen in neurons. For our visual learners, here's video of syncytia and apoptosis, cell death, in a bat brain. Luckily, the University of Glasgow found that whilst delta is optimized for fusion at the cell surface, Omicron achieves entry through endosomal fusion. This switch offers an explanation for its reduced syncytia formation. If you're interested in further understanding the host of neurological symptoms and the mechanisms underlying them, this Nature article is an excellent primer. Let's review. SARS-CoV-2 can cross the blood-brain barrier, and even mild or asymptomatic cases can cause loss of neurons and persistent cognitive defects. That doesn't sound mild to me. I like my brain, but it keeps getting worse. I'm noticing a trend here. The brain isn't the only organ affected. Testicular pathology has found evidence of SARS-CoV-2 antigen in Leydig cells, Sertoli cells, spermatogonia, and fibroblasts in postmortem examination. A Duke pathology study in Singapore detected SARS-CoV-2 in the colon, appendix, ileum, hemorrhoid, liver, gallbladder, and lymph nodes, suggesting widespread multi-organ involvement of the viral infection. The same study found evidence of residual virus in tissues during the convalescent phase up to 6 months after recovery in a non-postmortem setting, suggesting that a negative swab result might not necessarily indicate complete viral clearance from the body. It also causes microclots. Fibrinogen amyloid microclots and platelet hyperactivation were observed in long COVID patients, in this work by Stellenbosch University of South Africa, which also explored potential treatments. Let's review. SARS-CoV-2 attacks our veins, blood, heart, brain, testes, colon, appendix, liver, gallbladder, and lymph nodes. No, it's not just a respiratory virus. Not even close. There are also immunology implications. John Hopkins Fitter Happier AJ found that CD95-mediated T-cell differentiation and death may be advancing T-cells to greater effector acquisition, fewer numbers, and immune dysregulation. This Chinese military study of the initial Wuhan outbreak concluded that T cell counts are reduced significantly in COVID-19 patients, and the surviving T cells appear functionally exhausted. The study authors went on to warn, non-ICU patients with total T cells counts lower than 800 microliters may still require urgent intervention even in the immediate absence of more severe symptoms due to a high risk for further deterioration in condition. Those warnings have since been proven by discovery of autoimmune features. This study of 177 Los Angeles healthcare workers found that all had persistent self-attacking antibodies at least 6 months after infection, regardless of illness severity. In the words of T-cell immunologist Dr. Leonardi, SARS-CoV-2 is a pro at causing autoimmunity. It is unprecedented. It makes a never-before-seen hyperstimulated T-reg cell that causes autoimmunity. We may have long-term effects on par with rheumatic fever. This Kaiser Permanente, South California study found that although natural immunity provided substantial protection against reinfection, hospitalization was more common at suspected reinfection than initial infection. In fact, remember those cytokine storms? It turns out that even severe COVID-19 may not be a viral pneumonia, but an autoimmune attack of the lung. And the quoted tweet there from David Lee, MD, our study explaining the pathophysiology of acute COVID has been published by ERJ, the flagship scientific journal of the European Respiratory Society, at ERS Publications. Here, we describe how severe COVID-19 is not a viral pneumonia, but a post-viral autoimmune attack of the lung. So let's review. It's autoimmune. SARS-CoV-2 convinces our body to attack itself. That might explain why the Arizona study saw more symptoms after 60 days than at 30 days. It also means natural immunity isn't something to count on. But if you're counting on vaccination to feel safe, that's even more bad news. A study of Israeli healthcare workers found that most breakthrough cases were mild or asymptomatic, although 19% had persistent symptoms. Perhaps the most terrifying study is from Oxford University, which examined the effects of vaccination on long COVID symptoms, because not only did it find that vaccination does not protect against long COVID, but that long COVID symptoms become more likely over time. The narrow confidence intervals rule out the possibility that these negative findings are merely a result of lack of statistical power. The inclusion of death in a composite endpoint with these outcomes rules out survivorship bias as an explanation. That finding contradicts the findings from the UK Zoe app study, which found that the odds of having symptoms for 28 days or more after post-vaccination infection were approximately halved by having 2 vaccine doses. However, the structural limitations of the Zoe study, discussed in detail by Dr. Gurdsani in the linked thread, may explain why it is particularly susceptible to bias against detecting a progressive degenerative condition. Let's review. We've now shown that vaccination appears to offer no protection against the long-term autoimmune effect of COVID, which we know causes T cells to attack the lungs and can cause T cells to enter the brain. Why are we letting this run wild? Because of capitalism and greed. You may think, at least our children are safe. They are not. The CDC is tracking incidents of a life-threatening multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children following an acute COVID-19 infection, with 5,973 cases as of November 30th, 2021. Children also suffer from long COVID. More than half of pediatric patients reported at least one persisting symptom even 120 days after COVID-19, with 42.6% impaired by these symptoms during daily activities. Focusing exclusively on pediatric deaths is vastly underselling the danger to children. Anybody telling you that SARS-CoV-2 is just a cold or safe for children is lying to you. They are ignoring the massive body of research that indicates that it is anything but. Since our vaccines don't stop transmission and don't appear to stop long-term illness, a vaccination-only strategy is not going to be sufficient to prevent mass disability. This isn't something we want to expose our kids to. Let's review. Even for children and vaccinated people, a mild case of COVID causes symptoms that point to long-term autoimmune issues, potentially causing our own body to attack our brains, hearts, and lungs. Scared? Good. Now we're ready to get to work. Oh, finally. This is the virus most Americans don't know. We were born into a world where a virus was a thing you got over in a few weeks. S-Geek Female, to whom I owe a thank you for her editing assistance on this thread. The viruses they know in Kolkata, Kinshasa, and Wuhan are different, dangerous, lethal beasts. Since 2020, the field has been leveled. Willing or no, we've rejoined the rest of the world. We are, all of us, vulnerable in the face of an unfamiliar threat. The first step is acknowledging the threat. That means acknowledging that our response has been woefully inadequate and that is going to be uncomfortable. The thought that we could have prevented this but didn't will feel unconscionable to some. The knowledge that we could start preventing this today but haven't is unconscionable to me. And they quote themselves there with another tweet saying, as a society, we decided on an acceptable level of preventable deaths from smallpox. We decided on an acceptable level of preventable death from measles. We decided on an acceptable level of maimed and disabled children from polio. Do you know what we decided? 0. Yeah, remember when the world had a fucking backbone? It's time to quit pretending it's just a cold, or that there is some magical law of viruses that will make it evolve to an acceptable level. There's no such law of evolution, just wishful thinking, easily disproven by Ebola, smallpox, Marburg, polio, malaria. There are things we can do to reduce our individual risk immediately. That starts with wearing a good mask, an N95 or better, and choosing to avoid things like indoor dining in capacity crowd stadiums. This isn't a choice of individual freedom versus public health. It isn't authoritarian to ask people to change their behavior in order to save lives. As Arnold Schwarzenegger argued so convincingly in The Atlantic, it is our patriotic duty. Generations of Americans made incredible sacrifices, and we're going to throw fits about putting a mask over our mouth and nose? Sadly, yeah, because that's what right-wing media does to a motherfucker these days. Those who would sacrifice essential liberty for a little bit of temporary security deserve neither. What is the essential liberty here? It is the liberty to be able to breathe clean air, to live our lives without infecting our families and risking disability. To get there, we need to listen to our epidemiologists and public health experts, the ones who have been trying to tell us this since the beginning. It is time, long past time, to give up on the lazy fantasy that we can let it become endemic and uncontrolled because it inconveniences us, because it is killing our political opponents, or because the virus will magically evolve to some mild state. It is time, long past time, to begin controlling this virus. It's possible. Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea have done it. It saves lives. It's even good for the economy. Globally, economic contraction and growth closely mirror increases and decreases in COVID-19 cases. Public health strategies that reduce SARS-CoV-2 transmission also safeguard the economy. It's time. It's like he said, it is time for us to get this under control. These were just a ton of tweets. Thank you if you're still here at the end of it. But notice, a lot of those had cited sources, actual legitimate medical sources. These are facts we're dealing with, not feelings, not conspiracies, but cold, hard fact out of emerging evidence as we continue to study this new virus. And yet, unfortunately, there are still so many people out there thinking, no, I don't need to get vaccinated, or it's all part of some big conspiracy. And it's like, it's not. And you know, we want, at the end of the day, the same things. We want a semblance of normal life to return to us. But as that very first slide showed back at the start of this video, it is the unvaccinated that are taking up ICUs, which is resulting in closures and lockdowns so that we can try and give the already overworked and overstressed frontline workers a much needed goddamn break. And if you care about the economy, well, look, there's some actual hard evidence here too about why doing these proper protections is ultimately good for the economy. It's good for all our pocketbooks if we don't end up unable to live the full lives that we had led before getting infected or reinfected. It is good to take care of each other, and it is possible. We've done it in the past, and some countries are currently doing it now for the fucking coronavirus. We've lost sight of what it means to be in communities and society as we let greedy corporation after greedy corporation just continue to exploit the current situation because, oh, we can't possibly have a slowdown, even though a casual look outside reveals that the world is pretty proverbially and literally on fire. This is the grim and unfortunate reality of the coronavirus as we continue to understand more and more about it. Still holding out for really silly and untrue reasons helps no one. It just makes the situation worse. And I know at the end of the day, anti-vaxxers don't want that. I hope that this massive thread and this long video have been illuminating to people, and many thanks to the author for giving me permission to make this video about his massive and impeccably researched thread. But it is high time that anti-vaxxers join the rest of society, and that all of us together turn our attention onto the real culprits of this whole mess, which is the people in power, and that includes the politicians and the large CEOs and companies that bankroll them. These are the people here in Canada, in the States, Germany, Britain, Australia, wherever. These are the ghouls, the evil demons who have actually caused this problem in terms of preventing proper shutdowns early on and still trying to do this, oh, well, you know, maybe we can kind of walk a line and still be kind of open, and well, if you just kind of get infected, it should be fine, right? Even though we've, really never dealt with this before. That's why it's called the novel coronavirus. This all needs to end. It needs to stop. And we have several examples from around the world of countries showing us how it can be done. And quite frankly, we in the West, we have the resources. We can mobilize effectively to not only distribute vaccines around the world, but also to secure our own corners of the world against this virus. Smallpox and measles and polio are pretty much nearly non-existent anymore because of past global efforts at not only vaccination, but also disease eradication. Are we really saying that we can't do today, with all the technology and infrastructure that we have, we can't do what people were doing a century ago? Really? I don't buy that for one goddamn second. We can win. We can beat this. The problem is that the people at the top have zero interest in doing so. That's who we need to fight. That's who we need to hold accountable. And unfortunately, the fact that many people still don't realize this, and we're still fighting and bickering with each other while this whole situation continues to worsen when it could absolutely get better, is definitely what's bothering me today.